be. They're both
Welcome to our final book talk of the year. We're glad you come, but I have to tell you, you make me nervous every time. I'm here at 2 o'clock waiting for people to come, and nobody comes until 2:25, 2:26, 2:27. It makes me nervous every time. Maybe next year you can come just a tad earlier so I don't have to sweat it out so much. But anyway, we have a lovely book to talk about today, and we have two wonderful presenters. So please allow me to introduce LaDonna Womachow, who holds a PhD in American Literature with a minor in British Literature. She taught for 9 years at Texas Tech University. She then moved into the computer industry, working on computer interfaces and documentation and marketing. After several interruptions to her work life to play tennis, she went to work for Fidelity Investments. So many different careers this woman has held, and she says each with its own rewards. At Robeson, LaDonna is very active in local governments. She currently serves as chair of the Facilities Committee. She's active in numerous clubs and athletics. So please welcome LaDonna. And Cindy Voliva has, I should say LaDonna has as well, but Cindy Voliva has served on our book selection committee for the book talks for 3 years now, and LaDonna has 2. Cindy holds a master's degree in journalism as well as teaching credentials in Texas. She also has held a variety of jobs, from middle school teacher to youth minister in a Catholic church, to her favorite job of all, which was working in television news at Fox 13 in Tampa, Florida. Cindy says she loves the book Ordinary Grace because the writing is so beautiful. And she says William Kent Kruger does an amazing job of creating a place. And Cindy was transported to that little Minnesota town in 1960. So let us all be transported to that little Minnesota town as we present Ordinary Grace.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, I've used the microphone for a while, but you won't need to hear me because I have this teaching voice that goes all the way to the back of the room. So, but I will do it to start with. The first question I have is, how many of you actually read the book? Oh, I love it. Oh, it's been so good. All right, so we are not going to have a lecture. We are going to have a conversation amongst all of us on this book. And Cindy and my job is to kind of every once in a while prod us in a new direction so don't get all tangled up on one point. So that's the purpose of this. And so I'm going to turn this back over to Cindy, and she's going to give you kind of an update on who our man is. Okay?
Can you all see that okay? Can you hear me? Can you hear me if I just talk in my regular voice?
Actually better.
Or would you prefer this?
Regular voice.
Regular,
whoa.
Yeah. Okay. Because I would just prefer to talk to you if that's okay. William Kent Kruger was born in Wyoming, and he said his family was full of wanderlust. In fact, by the time he was a senior in high school, he'd already lived in 11 different houses, 8 different cities, and 6 different states. He said the only constant in his life was that he knew he wanted to be a writer, and that started when he was in about the 3rd grade. He already knew that's what he wanted to do. So I think he was very bright. He went to Stanford University on a scholarship, and immediately got into some trouble. It was 1969 when he started there, and the Vietnam War was at its height, and demonstrations, of course, in this country were at a high point also. So he felt like the Stanford University was complicit in providing production of military weapons, and he didn't like it, and he went to the dean's office and was sitting in, and the riot police came out after him, and they said, bye to your scholarship. So he left, but he said that's okay, because in the meantime he'd fallen in love with a Cornhusker, and he was headed to Nebraska to chase a girl. And so he went to Nebraska, and he had all kinds of odd jobs. He did everything from being a lumberjack to freelance journalism. He did construction, just anything he could find to make things, make ends meet. So he married his wife Diane, and they had a ball. They went all over the place. Maybe she had the wanderlust too, I don't know, but they wandered around the country until first child was coming. And at that point they decided we better settle down, so they moved to St. Paul, Minnesota. She enrolled in law school, and he continued to take whatever jobs he could, but he still was doing some writing. But you know, you've got to make ends meet, so he would get up at 5:30 in the morning, and he would go to this little diner called the Boiler. It had another name, there's it, the Boiler. He would go to the St. Clair Boiler, and he'd get there, they opened at 6 a.m. He'd get there at 6 a.m., he would write for an hour and a half, and then he would go to his job, whatever the job was that he had at that time. And then in the evening, he would write some more, but he was very relentless about, I must do my writing, I've got to write. He mostly wrote short stories. He had some success. He had some, they were printed, some of them won some awards, but he just kept going. And he still does that. He still does that, getting up early in the morning. He goes to another, the Boiler closed down, but he found another little coffee shop, and he goes there to this coffee shop, and he still writes that way. Now, I'm fascinated because I dab at writing. I wrote as a journalist. I've done writing in different jobs. I've taught writing. So I'm always interested in the process, what they do when they're doing it. So this is what he does. This brilliance of his comes. He buys those cheap notebooks that have the spiral, you know, and he just fills those up, and he writes longhand. And he sits there and he writes and he writes. And he had like booth number 4 or something when he was at the Boiler, and that was his place. He'd go there and he'd get his coffee and he'd sit there and he'd just write. And I think that what he says was his success was that he did it every day, and he still does it every day. He's in his 70s now, I believe, so it's pretty impressive the amount of time that he spent doing that. He loves the area in Minnesota. His books, he has a whole series of books with the main character is a guy named Corcoran O'Connor. Have any of you read those? If you have, yeah. Hey, if you haven't, oh my gosh. But now LaDonna teases me because I always say, if he wrote a phone book, I would read it. I truly would. I just think he's just wonderful. But anyway, he has this character named Corcoran O'Connor, and he's like a private investigator. I think he might have been the sheriff or something. He was a sheriff and he got booted. Yeah, that's right. He got booted out, and so now he does other things now. But the name Corcoran, he calls him Cork for short, and he said he liked the name because he wanted to write about someone whose life was always pressing down on him, but he would bob back up to the surface and succeed in the end. And I just thought, so if you haven't read those books, look them up, they're great, they're just great. And he's just the kinds of things that he thinks about when he's putting these books together, you can kind of tell in the writing itself. When you start reading, you're like, oh man, the way this all fits together is amazing. That's my ringtone. I was like, oh, that was me. He said books that he likes to read, authors he likes to read, Louise Erdrich. I don't know if you all have read anything by her. William Warren. He also likes Tony Hillerman, who sets his are in Arizona, and he uses the Navajo Indians in his. And Cork has a lot of the Ojibwe Indians in his. He also likes Dennis Lehane, Russell Banks, Toni Morrison, and James Lee Burke because of powerful use of language in his books. So he's in good company, the books that he reads. So that is, and he goes by Kent. So we'll just drop the William and call him Kent Kruger.
Now that's very familiar, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Very,
Yeah.
okay.
So our big question, LaDonna, why is this book so good?
And this is really what I want to talk about. This book is good. Does it feel familiar? When you read the book, it just feels like you're kind of at home.
Yes.
You know, the book is set in 1961. The kid, Frank, is 13 years old. Well, in 1961, I was 14. And I grew up in southwestern Iowa in the middle of nowhere. Kind of like this kid's growing up in Minnesota.
Yeah.
It just feels like home in
Yeah.
a lot of ways. Small town, lived out on the farm a lot. You know, it's one of those places where it just feels like the right stuff to me. And I suspect for a lot of us, it's about the right same timing. A lot of us were probably just entering into puberty, just got there, just about the same time this book is set. And so the behavior of Frank is really familiar. You know, I think one of my favorite lines about him is when he describes himself. Okay, I think this is so cool. And he's trying to describe his family, and this is on, I think it's on page 15, you can find it real quick. And he describes himself, and he says, he's talking about his father. He was a man with a son who stuttered, and another probably on his way to becoming a juvenile delinquent, and a daughter with a hairlip who sneaked in at night, from God knew where, and a wife who resented his profession. I think it's a wonderful description of the family. It is so right. You got these damaged kids, you got the kid who's just being a kid, not a very smart kid at times. You got parents that don't always get along. I mean, it just feels right. And I think that's one of the things about this book that makes it so attractive, is everything about it feels familiar. You know, it's about growing up. You know? I mean, what kind of we referred to him earlier as a dumbass kid that Frank is, because he does do stupid stuff. You know, he gets in a fight with this guy who's tough.
I think he has ADHD myself or something like that, because he doesn't think about the consequences. You know, when he pushed the kid in the water, kid can't swim.
And he knows that.
Kid can't swim, he knows it, pushes him in there, there's consequences. Yeah. He doesn't always think about what's gonna happen.
Right, exactly. He does that kind of stuff. He doesn't really, I love the part where he's the peeping Tom. You know, he's looking through the fence. Remember the lady with the big boobs, you know? The underwear, the lacy underwear. And here's this kid looking through the fence. Now, if that's not a 13-year-old boy, I can't imagine what it would not be. I mean, that is really the real McCoy. So he does that. And the other thing I think makes him kind of interesting is that, you know, he knows a little tiny bit, and then he goes, oh my gosh, he jumps to some huge conclusion about what that little bit really means. And oftentimes he actually has no clue. I mean, he didn't know what skag meant, but he knew it wasn't good, so he made this big leap of faith about a bed. He didn't know what the word faggot meant either, and then he made this big leap of faith, some sort of conclusions. He's like most kids. He gets a little bit of information, and then he just goes, oh my gosh, this must mean what it means. This must be where it's going. And so he is so real to me as a kid. You know, and I think when I was little or younger, I did some of the same kind of dumb stuff. You know, you see him out. The other thing I think I like about this book that makes it so familiar is in 1961, the kids were not on cell phones. They weren't on their computers. They were outside. They were outside throwing baseball, traveling around,
on foot,
walking everywhere because they didn't have a car. Didn't even have a motorcycle, except for you knew somebody who had a motorcycle. You know, so there's just something about him, you know, that is just right. You know, he's just a kid. He has a brother. I love the one piece I like about it. You know, every family has their dynamics, and this family has a very unusual set of dynamics, I think. But I think when Jake and Nathan and Frank are going to go for a ride with Nathan, the father, and they race to the car, and one says, "Shotgun!" I mean, what more can you ask? And so when you think about all those kind of things, you know, you just recognize that personality. You recognize who that kid is. You recognize the brother. You're going to see more. We're going to talk more about some of the things you're going to see about the whole family dynamics. But I think that's one of the reasons why this book is so good. You just feel the family. There's no question about it. And the other thing that's kind of, I think, real about this book is something that is kind of the heart of the book in a lot of respects. And that is there's the ordinary life, things are just rocking along, and then something happens. Some event or series of events happens, and things just fall apart, so to speak. And I think that's also a very real thing. You know, are we talking about the same thing? We all feel the same way? I mean, I don't know if you've had experience when you were a kid where something in your family just went way haywire. You know, maybe it was having to move, or maybe a parent or grandparent passed on, or something like that. And it just changes your whole world. And I think that's what you see in this book. That's why it's so comfortable to read. It just seems like Kent, got his name right, is not making it up. He is really just describing what it's like to be 13 in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, you know, and dealing with your family and dealing with things that happen to him or he sees happen to somebody else. So that's really, I think, one of the cool parts of this book. That's why it just feels good to read this book, I think. A couple of things I want to just talk about just as a professor. is this type of literature, what we're seeing here, is not new news. I mean, we all talk about coming-of-age books. There's fancy title for it called a Bildungsroman, which is a German term, and it has to do with someone, an individual, who's changing over time, and either growing up or maturing in some way. Very typical stuff. There's 4 things that have to be part of a Bildungsroman to be considered that. It has to have a loss, something that's tragic or eventful for the person. You have to go on a journey or be moving in a way on a journey, going forward, doing something. You can have conflict, in which Frank has a lot of conflict, so he's always in trouble about something, or personal growth, and then you come to some level of maturity, and that's what you would consider a Bildungsroman. Famous ones are Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. Okay. Another famous one is, this is why it's got a German name, this thing. It's called The Sorrow of Young Werther, and it's written by Goethe. Jane Eyre is considered a Bildungsroman. David Copperfield, Huckleberry Finn, sound familiar? The Catcher in the Rye, I didn't thought of that one. That one got by me in a hurry. To Kill a Mockingbird is one that I think of all the time, because it is what we see, exactly. And here's one I never even thought about, the entire Harry Potter series. That is a kind of Bildungsroman. So you see that, and all of us have read stories like this, where someone is maturing, some young person is maturing, things happen, they get better. That coming-of-age story is really commonplace. But because it's commonplace in what we read, it's comfortable to read it. It's really comfortable to read it. Now, the other thing that's very comfortable about this in terms of literature is this is a mystery. No surprise, right? Not much of a mystery, but it's a mystery. And according to Kant, he refers to mysteries as the most egalitarian art form because it applies everywhere. It does all kinds of stuff. You know, there's grisly mysteries. You cannot pay me to read John Patterson anymore. It's just not going to happen. That is just too grisly for words. On the other hand, I love Kate Atkinson. Her book, one of my favorite ones, Started Early, Took the Dog. I mean, those are mysteries. And they go all the way from grisly to funny. And this book is just one of those things. Typical thing. This is what Kent Kruger says about mysteries. He says there's 3 things that have to happen. Just 3. He says, first of all, something has to happen. Something disturbing. Murder, burglary, whatever. Then there's an investigation. Okay, someone's doing the work to figure this one out. And then the final thing is answers are found, but not necessarily all of them. And that's kind of true with this book. We don't know at the end of this book about Nathan, about the father, why he was so disturbed by the war. We don't know that. But I think it's kind of interesting that this kind of literature appeals to all of us. How many of you read mystery books? Like every night, every other night? Yeah. Me too. I got one going right now. Okay? So I think all those things, plus Kent's skill, really makes us comfortable in reading this book. Even if there are parts of this book that are sad and disturbing, we still feel very comfortable reading it because it's about a world that we know, we feel, we understand, we've seen before. And I think that's really kind of important as you think about this particular book. So, enough said about that nonsense, okay? Anybody else want to comment on the literature, the literary part of this thing? Let's move on to the good stuff then.
Do you want to talk about the serious matters?
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. The serious stuff. Excuse me. I forgot about that. Yes.
So much of what's happening, he's at a point in his life where he's realizing the adult world around him. You know, instead of, before that, maybe he would have just been a kid just playing baseball, doing his thing, but all of a sudden, he's looking up and he's paying attention to what the adults are doing. And it's for the first time that he's hearing some of these things. He's hearing about marital problems that his neighbors are having. It's kind of a small part of the story, to the story. It doesn't really move the mystery forward, but there's that whole business of listening to something that he knows he's not supposed to. And he does a lot of eavesdropping, and he gets a lot of his information that way. And there are other things that are happening along the way that somebody his own age dying, that's going to have a huge impact on him. You know, here's somebody that he knew, but maybe didn't spend as much time learning about as he should have, or thinks that. So he's got some guilt about that too. So he's got some feelings that are really uncomfortable to him that he's never had to.
I think when he finds the itinerant,
oh yeah,
it's a new experience. Here's someone who's died, that nobody knows.
Right.
And it's disturbing to him.
Look at the way he reacted to it. He went to, he was gonna go to that funeral.
Right.
He was gonna get dressed and go to a funeral. So he's a minister's son. He probably has been to more funerals than he cares to do
Right.
it. And yet he said, no, I'm gonna go, I'm doing this
And they
one.
don't even know who this guy is.
Right.
And that's
But he-
a big exposure.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right on that. So there are a lot of things that are happening in this that is happening for the first time. And sometimes he rises to the occasion, like with the itinerant, and he goes there and he pays respect. And sometimes he totally misses the mark on it. He doesn't understand what's happening or what kind of a huge deal it is. Like Brandt, Carl Brandt,
Yes.
Carl Brandt's secret. When that's getting out in the
Exactly.
community, he doesn't realize what kind of an impact that's going to have.
Exactly, and I think that's really kind of important, and that's really what I was talking about earlier. He gets little pieces of information and he doesn't really kind of know what to do with it. And sometimes he's just flat wrong. He doesn't get it at all. But what you do see about him though is he has a real sense of value about some things. When he takes an interest in the itinerant's death, I think that's a remarkable statement. Because he doesn't know him, he found him by accident, he's not sure what happened, nobody really knows for sure. So I think it's really telling about who he is as a person. So, and I think you mentioned seeing somebody else in the community having marital problems. When his parents separate, that is a big deal to this kid, and everything is kind of falling apart all the way around, let alone his sister passing away.
Yeah, lots and lots of stuff happening there. Okay, and we're going to give you one more. This is kind of a cool thing. So the book is set in New Bremen, Minnesota, and I said I like the sense of place. And what I mean by that, the sense of place, it's more than just New Bremen in the summer of 1961. It's more than but it's those little details that give us the full picture of it. But talk to us about domestic erotica.
Okay, yeah, erotica, not erotica.
What? Oh, exotica! Wait a minute. I have to tell you guys, I am not firing on all cylinders. I'm sorry, exotica. I survived Hurricane Milton and I'm barely here. So I apologize. You have more than you paid for today. Okay, go for it. Exotica.
I think this is really kind of cool too. We just talk a little bit about this. I love it. Okay.
You won't forget this.
Yeah.
We may not get it back.
Probably not.
Probably
We're
not.
done. We're probably finished for the day. Okay. Anyway, I think that sense of place is really kind of important. And Cindy mentioned this. Don't you feel like New Bremen is like down the road 20 miles? You've been there, you've seen that, you felt it, you know what it's like. And I think that's really cool. And it's not just about the scenery, because you get a sense of everything. Think about how many times that Frank describes something he smelled. I remember Gus is in one evening after things were really going south with Ariel. He's in there and he makes the boys food. He describes the potatoes they chop up.
Yeah.
He describes the spam.
Spam.
That he chops
I
up.
like spam.
I mean, it's just, you smell it. You sense it. You feel it. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, there are all kinds of descriptions in this book that just brings to your mind what this world is like. And I think one of the coolest ones, there's two things, and I didn't know this today. One of the cool things is what is Frank and Jane doing all the time? They're walking somewhere. They go downtown, they go down to the river, they go
Railroad
here,
tracks.
railroad tracks, you pick it.
Trellis.
Trellis. And this is kind of interesting, when they're mad at somebody or frustrated or uncertain, they'll say, we'll get you a lift. And they say, no, we're going to walk.
Yeah.
And they take off and they walk the river. So you actually can almost lay out a map of New Bremen if you follow these kids around in this book. They go here, they go down that street, they turn left, they go right, they go down the river. I mean, all of that gives you this kind of limited world. And then on top of that, I love this part, they name their cars.
Yes. Yes.
Every time you turn around, they're talking about the Packard going here, or the Packard going, I don't even remember what a Packard looks like.
Big
A long
fenders.
time ago, yes. I can't remember. So I think, once again, that's part of this domestic and I think, and the descriptions of the river, you'll never look that one down.
Right.
I'm writing that one down. Okay. I think another thing that's part of this domestic exotica is all the rituals we see. The visitation after Ariel's death. Do you not get the whole detail?
Yeah.
There's all these people coming to say nice things and support. They got food coming out of the
Kitchens,
wazoo.
kitchens full of
Everywhere
food.
that somebody's bringing them food. They're eating food for 3 days after, you know.
Right.
And that whole sense of ritual is just really kind of cool. It's part of this domestic community that we see in this book. And I think that's really
You know,
an amazing piece.
After Ariel died and people are coming and the dad and stepmother were coming and helping with it, I could feel the exhaustion in that
Oh.
room as more and more. Did y'all feel that too? You know, just that sense of just.
Yes.
It's just so hard to go on. I don't know how he does that. I don't know if it's just my emotions as I'm reading it and remembering things that have happened in my own life with those. But did y'all experience that?
Absolutely.
Well, I think here's the thing that really makes this really concrete. Right after Ariel's passing and all this stuff's been happening, Gus takes Jake and Frank to Ginger's place.
Yeah.
And they go on a horseback ride. I mean, how more rural, how more domestic could that be?
Somebody said it therapeutic.
Therapy.
They
There
use
you go.
horses for therapy now.
There you
yeah.
go, exactly. And you know, one of the kind of interesting parts of that episode is that Frank feels kind of guilty. Because for that hour, he's forgotten about his sister passing.
So real.
But again, it's just how the world works, you know? It's how the world works. You take someone, you've got a crisis, and you try to distract them by something that's useful, pleasant, whatever. And here we have Kent, smart man, smart Arthur, giving us a description of these young boys who are out riding. Now, Frank wants to go galloping down the road, and she says, later, maybe later, not now. We're just going to go for a nice ride. So, you know, there's an impulsive
But
Frank.
that's impulsive Frank.
It's impulsive Frank.
It's his
Right.
nature. Of course, he's going to try and go fast.
Yeah. So I think that's, you know, I think that's just part of the world that Kent has developed for us. The other thing I think is kind of interesting, and this is really true, it's true where I lived and grew up in Iowa, in southwestern Iowa. The local prejudices are there. They're laid out in front of us, you know. If you lived in the Heights, or if you lived in the Flats, that was a big deal difference. If you were an Indian, and you were not white, that was a big deal difference. So we see all the local prejudices, and obviously the biggest one that causes the most tragedy in the election, there's a couple of them, is Carl, the prejudice against homosexuals. That's just so frightening. And Carl tries to defend himself by lying about his relationship with Ariel. So you see all of that as part of this world, this domestic exotica, this world that Kent Kruger has created for us. Somebody else got an idea? Add one to it?
It just felt like it could have been a true story.
It does feel true.
Right.
Exactly. Everything about it rings true. And that's kind of amazing, I think. There's a lot of books we read just, you know, you get halfway through and you're going, not really. This one, I don't think you ever say not really. It just feels right all along the way. So much for domestic erotica.
Sorry. What happens in the library stays in the library. I don't want you stopping me on the street and asking me about it. We're going to talk a little bit about the structure of this book. Just on the straight and narrow.
Now we're going to talk structure. Now it gets boring.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, just a
for a
quick
second.
little, because
Okay.
we've already kind of hit on it a little bit
Yeah, I
with
think we
the,
have.
yeah.
I think this is one of the techniques of this author that I think makes it really kind of a solid book. You know, the first half of the book is really about introducing us to the characters and the setting, to the domestic stuff. It really is. You know, we find out about Bobby Cole's, in the very first chapter, Bobby Cole is hit with a train. But, you know, it goes on like that. So the first half of this book says, here's what's happened, here's the people that are living in this town, here's what they're kind of like, you kind of get a feel for who they are and what they are. And everything's just kind of fine by the first 150, 180 pages. Boom. After that, it's about the effects of what's happened on the individuals. So you get this sense of tragedy, you know, coming because now all the things that you've learned early on, which you absolutely believe, now you're having the author let you see what happens when these big events affect, how they affect people. And so there's kind of really two parts to this book. And, you know, in the first 20 pages, Jane Schultz talks about this a lot. In the first 20 pages, you know a whole lot about this town. You know a whole lot about Frank. Some of it's not altogether good, but you don't know a whole lot about Frank. You know a lot about Jake. Okay, but you don't really get the sense of all the damage that's being done until you get toward the last half of the book. And I think it just kind of builds the tragedy. I mean, if this were a play, as opposed to a novel, you know, there's the first act, you start, and then there's the middle act, there's a little bit of something else, but then the real action is in the last act of the play. It kind of comes to a climax and comes to resolution. So that's really, just wanting you to know that as you think about the book yourself, you know, what you learned and where you learned these things along the way. So, how about that? That's enough nonsense
Yeah,
on that,
yeah.
right? Okay, moving on.
We're good. All right. There are a lot of characters in this book. Who do you think is the most important character for you when you're looking at this list? Who do you think is the most important character?
Speak up, speak out.
I read the book so long ago, I can't remember.
All right, we'll help you. Somebody else help out here. Who's the most important character in this book?
Frank.
You think?
Frank.
Okay, tell me why. Or,
Well, because it was first person, he told it through his
right,
eyes.
he's a
It's
narrator.
his story, really.
It's his story,
It's his
yeah,
story.
it's his story.
I think it's a toss-up between Frank and Jake.
I'm between Jake. Why do you think
I
Jake?
think Jake is the one that really brings everything to a head.
Right.
I think Frank does everything he does in defense of Jake. And Jake is the one that actually brings the book to a climax with his ordinary grace. And
Exactly.
I really think he has really a more important part
Mhm.
than Frank. Frank is kind of
Because
the
he's so
narrator that
insightful.
tells Jake's story.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Jake carries
I think
the
Jake
message.
carries so much, and Frank just kind of tells his story.
Tells the story. Yep. Anybody else got an opinion?
The meat of the story.
The meat of the story.
Jake?
What's it about?
Jake seemed very insightful, even though he was
Exactly.
withdrawn
Right.
because of his stuttering and everything.
Yeah.
He observed the world without saying a lot, and when he did say something, it was very insightful.
Yeah. He's very
He said
intuitive.
little, but what he said was a
Right.
bunch of
Yeah,
Right.
he's
Right.
very intuitive. He senses what is real and what's not real. I think, I would agree, he's a really big character, and
And
he
he's
definitely
always
carries the message.
involved. He's involved in every pivotal part, whether it is being the interpreter, if you will, for Liesel, spilling the beans about Brandt,
About Carl,
or,
yeah, right.
Carl Brandt, or saying grace without stuttering.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
he is at the heart of it every time. And also, I like the way that he, when after Ariel dies, and Frank's just kind of wandering around the town, doesn't know what to do. And, Jake goes to his room, and there's even a whole passage in this talking about when Jesus goes to Gethsemane.
Yes,
And
exactly.
there's kind of that sense that Jake pulls back and is very, and even as a small boy, he is able to be a little bit insightful within himself and think about it. And maybe because he is often an observer, because it's so hard for him to communicate.
Right. And the other thing I think, he's the truth teller. What he says is true.
He is a truth teller.
You know, with Frank, you're never quite certain. I mean, he's 13
That's
years
right.
old, you never know exactly where he's going.
Yeah, he says to him, do you know what skank means? Yeah,
Yeah,
I
sure, I
know.
know, absolutely.
But you know he doesn't know.
Yeah, not a clue.
But Jake wouldn't do that. Jake would say, no, no,
I
Mary.
guess though with Frank, he's the one who said, we're gonna go here, we're gonna go there.
Right.
He did call the
Jake was always
shots.
following along, and he called the shots.
Exactly.
He made decisions at the end, he said to Jake, you knew this, didn't you? You know, so that's why I still pick Frank.
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with Frank, and I think you're right.
I
And
think you could,
obviously,
yeah. I don't think there's a right answer here.
I think that the important point about him is he's the person who is looking back on this life.
Yeah.
And he's the one that's commenting on it. And he is shaping that commentary.
It's his truth.
It's his truth,
It's his truth.
exactly, it's his
Yeah.
truth. I think the thing about Jake that makes him interesting is that he is intuitive, where I don't think we accuse Frank of being intuitive.
I think he's confused.
He's confused. He's a kid. He's a 13-year-old. You know, he's a kid. You know, he's doing what he's doing. There's some other interesting characters in this book. For example, Nathan, that's the father, that's the minister. Okay.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, here we go. I'm such a,
We've had big discussions
we had,
about the name.
we talked about this today at the kitchen table. I am such a cynic. I just think Nathan's too good to be true. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
He's just perfect, darn
Has
it.
anybody ever in this room had a father like that?
No.
No.
No, but you know what, here's what I think. Here's what I think. I think that whatever he's carrying from the war is so huge, his
Right.
guilt is so big, that everything he does is weighed by that.
Yeah.
And in order to have, he feels he's such a damaged soul that he has to do something so much better than what the normal person would do, because it's got to offset whatever it was that he sees as being this ultimate tragedy that he committed. You know, whatever, which we don't know, we never do find out what it is, that he lost men somehow, and he feels responsible for the deaths of these men. And so everything he does, every step he takes now, he carries them with him.
And I think he's the title. I mean, he has that ordinary grace. I think that's part of it. But to me, he still feels too good to be true. I mean, he's just too darn.
Okay, how many people think he's too good to be true?
Is he too perfect?
Or is he
just
carrying
me?
a heavy load?
Okay, I'm
I'm
just
with you,
saying.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, all right, okay.
So, people growing up with World War II veterans and World War I veterans, my stepdad was a veteran, and he got a Purple Heart and all that, but he never talked about the war.
They did not talk about
And
it.
I'm married to a veteran myself right now, and the only time he talks about the USS Iowa explosion is when he's with his buddies
Right.
that understand
We're
it.
gonna talk about that, because I think that's really
I
critical.
think you're right.
That
And
brotherhood
that's the
thing.
role that Gus plays,
Yes.
too, a little bit.
Yeah.
Gus is there to help him a little bit with his
Right.
wounds.
Well, I think there's a couple things. I do think we need to talk about Gus a little bit more, because I think he is definitely kind of the glue in the book, in one sense, you know. And he's not the lead character by any stretch of the imagination, but he's the glue, because he's involved in all the critical moments.
Right.
You know,
Well, yeah.
he's
One of the
absolutely.
reviews that I read, I can't remember if it was Kent, that's our friend
What?
Kent,
Our friend
that said
Kent.
it, or if it was the reviewer, but they said that Gus is kind of the backbone of the family. He really holds the family together.
Yeah.
You know, mom's taken off, dad's over here, and he's the one feeding the boys. He
Yeah.
really is kind of a member of that family, and an extra adult in a way that maybe an uncle or a grandparent would take.
Exactly.
And then he
exactly.
started out as a drunk.
And he is a drunk,
Exactly.
yeah,
And that's when we
yeah.
first see
Yeah,
him.
he's in the drunk tank.
So we know that he is also a damaged soul. There is nobody in this book that's not a damaged soul.
Right.
In some way or another, they have physical, or they have mental, but they're all damaged people.
Yep, exactly. But I do think that Gus is really important, you know, because he does carry, he does what he can to hold the boys together. Not so much Ruth and Nathan, but he's really, you know, focused on those kids and making sure that they are well tended to, and they go to him. They go to him when they're not certain they can approach their father or their mother, and so I think that's kind of interesting. So I think who's the most important character is a big toss-up. Some of them, I think there's some red herrings in here, don't you think? Who's your favorite red herring is? Who did you think did it?
At first, Doyle.
Me too.
He's
awful.
Yeah.
He's a creep. Yeah, he's a creep. So he was easy. He was an easy mark.
Right.
Anybody else have another suggestion for another red herring? I actually thought at one point Gus was.
Oh, wow.
Yes, I do. At one point, Miss Number 1 like.
Well, you distrust Nathan.
Yeah. So
Well, I
that's-
mean, because he did, when he was drunk, he was really
He was
pretty
violent.
abrasive towards Nathan and bringing up the, you know,
Yep.
he obviously holds him responsible for it.
Yep, he does. So I thought about him for a minute. That was easy. I didn't get to Liesel. It was, you know, just a few pages before I got there, I thought, well, maybe? And then it was obvious.
That shocked me when it
You thought it was her all along?
came out. No,
She was shocked by it.
Oh, shocked by it, okay. Okay, well, I think it's easy to be shocked by it, because it's
I had
not
to
what
read
you.
it
Thought it was
twice.
her
I had to
brother,
listen to
yeah.
it twice.
That's nice too. Right.
Yeah, so, okay, so there we go, so there we
What
go.
somebody else said back there, what'd y'all say?
What'd you say? Wait a
Well,
minute.
Nancy thought it was her, and I was shocked.
Yes,
yeah.
well, it took me a while to figure it out. I think that there are some clues along the way when she
Right.
takes a swing
When she took-
at Frank, when he touches her and she's surprised. But still, it's really not what I was expecting at all.
Right.
For instance, so, and I think Doyle as a red herring is way too easy. I mean,
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, write him off
He
right away.
was, yeah.
He's just so awful, though,
He's so
too. Like,
awful.
you kind of wanted it to be him
Nobody
because
liked
you know, I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know. Oh, you know who we didn't put on this list?
Who?
Redgrave.
Oh, Warren, of course.
Warren.
That's what everybody else thinks too.
Oh, right.
That's who they thought did it.
Right.
Didn't even put him on the list, sorry.
Warren.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the Warren
The-
Redgrave.
Red, what was it,
Right.
red coat?
Right.
Redgrave?
Racing with red something.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, he's the one that,
How do we miss him?
I don't know. That was
Yeah.
not good
Gonna be just-
You know, he was there with the itinerant, and that's
Yes.
where Frank sees him.
He has the glasses.
He
He
had
had
glasses,
glasses.
he had
Glasses.
glasses.
I know.
And, you know, Frank
necklace.
thinks he did it, you know, he has the Ariel's necklace. You know, I mean, it's so clearly that he would be the person that Frank suspects did it.
And the town wanted it to be him because
Yeah,
it was
he's
easy
Yeah.
for them to
Yeah.
tie it
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
It's a really nice little bow.
Yeah.
It would have been easy for it to be him.
It would be,
Yes.
exactly, from the town's perspective, he is this outsider, this outcast. That
And
is true.
Morris is the other one that would be an easy one for the town to
That's true.
blame.
To blame easily, because they're in the wrong group. you know,
Right.
So to speak, they're in the wrong group. I think it's interesting, and we're talking about this a little bit, I think it's interesting, even though we talk about Jake being intuitive, you know, Frank makes a decision, literally, not to tell people which way Warren went when he was running away. And that has no basis on anything in terms of facts. Frank just says, I'm not gonna turn him, I'm not gonna point toward him, and he lets him go. So at some point in time, Frank is pretty intuitive as well.
I think he's growing, I think that
That's
shows
it.
his, you know, if you're looking at that with the coming of age, with the growth and that's what, he's seeing that it's, they're after him like they're hunting, like they're out on a hunt for a fox.
Exactly.
And he sees this as being kind of an inhumane thing and
Right.
makes a decision and then feels horribly guilty because he thinks he let his sister's killer go.
And he
So
does
then he's
for a
gotta
while.
carry that along, he can't tell anybody, he feels so
Yes.
bad.
And he does it for a long time.
The
Yes.
guilt that he was carrying before because the Indian said, you're killing me, or you know, he was
yeah.
gonna be and he didn't wanna be responsible for any more
Any more doubt.
Any more
pain
death,
or
that's
anything like
right.
that. So
Exactly.
that's why he, I think, protected him and then ended up
But he
being.
makes that decision just like boom. Of course, that's a kid again. Just boom, I'm making this decision, it's gonna work. And then he does feel a tremendous amount of guilt throughout for the next 50, 60, 70 pages in the book. So.
But I don't know that the Frank at the beginning of the story had remorse. I don't for anything. I think he just kind of lived his life because things were a lot simpler.
This
And I
is
think
true.
that it's building and building and building, and the things he's getting into are more and more complex and more difficult.
Yeah. He's obviously, well, first of all, he has to deal with this stuff, so he has to make some decisions, and you would expect some growth. And he does show growth, I would give you that. And he actually shows growth as the book moves on toward the end. And at the end of the book, he's clearly a grown-up. I mean, at the very end of the book, he's really a true grown-up in a lot of ways. I think that's really kind of amazing. It's amazing we forgot Warren. I mean,
I know,
that's
it's
the most
weird.
obvious. Hello.
Well, that's okay, and let us.
We're moving right along, okay.
All right, Aeschylus.
Yeah, okay.
So this is in two different places, it's at the beginning and at the end. He talks about this, it was his father's favorite quote. He who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God.
Do you all know who Aeschylus is? None of you might know. Aeschylus was a Greek dramatist from 525 to 455 BC. And he is kind of famous. I'll bet when you were in school, college, wherever, you had to read Agamemnon, right?
I don't know.
That's Aeschylus. If you read Oedipus, that's Aeschylus. Okay, that's who he was. He was considered the best Greek dramatist. And he did a lot of things to change the way the Greek theater worked. I mean, he introduced new items.
Well, and a lot of things we still do, a lot of plays still use the ideas
Of the course,
that
absolutely.
he started.
Yes, and he really, and all the stuff he writes, remember Clytemnestra? She was the nastiest woman that ever drew breath, I swear. She's the one that killed her daughter to avenge her husband's fooling around with Cassandra. Not a nice woman. Anyway, but one of the things that Aeschylus does talk about in most of his tragedies is that there's all this nasty stuff going on, evil, fierce behavior, brutal. But eventually, it all ends in some sort of reconciliation. And that's really what Aeschylus was about, was seeing that all these horrible things that happen, sometimes they're generational, they go from one family member to the next one and so on down. But at the end of it all, there is an opportunity for reconciliation, for resolving it in a way that recreates calm and peace. And I think that's why he's in this book. I think that's part of why it's so important. So.
This idea of the awful grace of God, that's just, it has to do with the majesty of it, the size of it. It's not awful in the way that we think of, I hurt myself and that's awful, it's not like that, but it's the, and this idea that through suffering, something good can come, things that we wouldn't have even recognized if something terrible hadn't happened. For instance, the fresh in my mind was this Hurricane Milton. I was down there evacuating my parents. We came back and the neighborhood was just in terrible shape, and the young neighbors across the street had cleaned up my parents' yard, a
Oh.
good amount of their yard before they got there. Well, I hate that we had to go through this terrible hurricane to find out that there's some really kind people across the street. You know, but at the same time, without those terrible things, we don't find the goodness, and we don't see the goodness in it. I mean, that's kind of a simple idea of it, but it gets that, we see the awful grace of God all around us, if we're willing to see, if we're willing to open our eyes.
Right, and one of the things I read, it talked about what happens, this wisdom that we achieve is a wisdom that comes with love and compassion. We have the suffering, but then there's love and compassion that follows on us.
Right,
And that's why
right.
it is that awful grace of God. It's big, it's huge, but it is in the long term a benefit. Short term it doesn't feel like one, but long term it is a benefit. I think that's a really important part, and this book certainly talks about that. All these instances that take place in the summer of 1961 lead to wisdom and compassion.
For a lifetime.
For a lifetime, and we see it at the end of the book. We really do. Yeah, the other guy we're going to talk about just for half a second. This is the opening part of the book. It's the first page of the book. It talks about the heart has reasons that reason does not understand. And this guy, Blaise Pascal, is kind of an interesting fellow. He's French, and he was born in 1623, died in 1662. He was a mathematician, very famous mathematician, very, very important mathematician. He was a physicist. He worked on barometric pressure. He used mercury thermometers. He did all kinds of cool stuff. He was a religious philosopher and was part of the Catholic Church. He was not part of the church, but that was his belief. But the interesting thing about him, and he wrote lots and lots of stuff, very well read by a lot of people. Rousseau, who's a famous philosopher, and Bergson followed Pascal. And then the existentialists, also, all those current day existentialists, Sartre, people like that, also followed in his notions of life. But it's interesting because he believed that you experienced God not through any rational thought per se, which is kind of interesting since he's a rational man, but through the heart. You feel things. And the school of philosophy is called intuitionism, because it's about how people intuit things. Now the interesting thing, this is what I read about it, because I have not read Pascal. I think he's way over my head. But one of the things they talk about is even though he has this sense of the heart being the value of things, what you intuit, what you feel is more important. He writes about it in a very rational and scientific way. So I think that's why we're seeing this.
Yeah, when you see scientists having these kind of,
Yes.
there are things that.
I think one of the
What is
things that you could say about that was, one of the things I underlined was when Frank says, my mother singing made me believe that God had taken Bobby Cole for the best of reasons.
There you go.
And that's the intuitive.
Yes,
thing
absolutely.
that I
That gives
think
me
he's
chills. That's a
talking about
perfect
here.
example
That
of
is a
that.
great example. It's a lovely, and she's sung Sweet Low, Sweet Chariot.
Chariot, yeah.
Yes, and Frank is responding to that, which is,
Right.
guys, moving forward, this kid's gonna run up after all. Anyway, so I thought those are kind of important things. Okay, let's talk about some of the big old themes stuff.
First one, brotherhood.
Okay.
There are lots of examples of brotherhood in this, and the obvious one, Frank and Nick and Jake, and their relationship and how tight they are. You know, at one point, Jake says, this was after Ariel died. He says, "You're my best friend, Frank. You're my best friend in the world. You always have been. You always will be." And so there's that sense. There's also a brotherhood between Gus and Nathan. They were brothers in arms. They had that military experience. They've been through things together that the rest of us can't imagine. And then I would even say there's a brotherhood of the good old boys network, you know, with the
Doyle.
Yeah, Doyle
Gus,
and
the drugstore guy. The guy was a drugstore guy.
Yeah.
They're playing poker and they're drinking in the back room.
Yeah. So I think that idea of this companionship and brotherhood it plays in a lot of different places in this book.
Well, I think that one's kind of cool because that one eventually breaks up.
The good old boys, yeah.
Gus has had enough of Doyle. Oh, he's gone. And once he and Ginger kind of work things out and life is good with that, then he doesn't need Doyle anymore. And Doyle's not likable ever in this book as far as I'm concerned. But I think the other thing that's kind of important about this brotherhood concept is there's the fear of it breaking up that's really important. You know, if you look at Liesl and Emil, it's critical that they stay together for Liesl. And for Emil for that matter.
Well, and also for, what can I keep his name?
Oh, Morris?
Morris, no, not Morris, the other one.
Carl.
Carl's parents.
Oh, yes,
Carl's
that's
parents don't wanna deal with Lisa.
Right, exactly.
They don't want her.
Right, they
So
don't.
that's what, this was the perfect thing, we'll take the guy who's disfigured, we'll put her with the girl who doesn't talk, and it'll be fine, they'll be there, yeah,
Exactly.
and then we
They're
won't
right.
deal with it.
So this, and for Liesl, I think the reason that we lose, that Ariel is dead is because Liesl is really in fear of losing that contact with her brother.
Yeah.
That close bond, that brotherhood, and of course it's brother-sister thing, but it's the same notion.
Siblinghood, we'll just call
Yeah,
it
it's that
siblinghood.
relation, that family tightness is there. So that's a really significant part of this book, I think, in so many different ways. And it's the ones that stay together, the ones that get stronger over time. Because over time, Jake and Frank get tighter and tighter as time goes on. And at the end of the book, even though they don't live close to each other, they are still
Yeah, they're
really
in
tight.
communication.
So that's kind
Yeah.
of cool. And then you have this thing about the fear. What happens if your brotherhood breaks up? Well, it does for Lisa, and it's a traumatic experience, and it's a deadly experience for Ariel.
Well, they lost Ariel, and clearly she kind of watched over them, and
Yeah, oh, yes. Yes.
and really took good care of them, and she was very kind to both of them. And so they did lose her, so there was that, and that's what, when when Jake said that to Frank, it was after she was gone, they realized that it was just the two of them, so,
Right.
so that sense of.
Yeah, and they talk a lot about missing her and how warm it was to have her there. Not that she was doing anything different, special. She was just being that sister who they could talk to and relax with, because they don't relax well with their mother.
No.
Ever, not the first half of the book anyway.
There's also another one of the themes has to do with community. You want to talk about?
Yeah, well, let me talk about this for a second. I think there's a couple things. First of all, there's the reinforcement of the community. You know, when everybody, at the visitation, they all come together to reinforce each other, to help each other. That is just as real as it can be. And in small town America, it's probably more so than anywhere else. It's actually true here. Think of all the people who have become ill. We all provide food for them. We make sure they're okay. We take them to the doctors. It's a notion of community that's really important, and it gets reinforced. And in the smaller communities, I think it's easier to see because there's so few of you, so few of us, and you just find a way. You take care of that. That's really cool. But the other thing about community, which is kind of a problem, is there's a lot of ridicule within the community. I get so mad at Morris when he calls Jake Howdy Doody. I think that is, he ridicules this
Right.
little boy.
Right,
I mean, what a bully.
right,
And that ridicule isn't just with Morris. Doyle ridicules.
right.
Anybody, they all make fun of him. You know, they make fun of Bobby Cole because he's not as smart and fast and quick as the rest of them. So there's that sense of ridicule that's part of this community. It's really not very pleasant. And it's really, it hurts. It hurts a lot. When Jake talks about being bullied, that's a tough couple paragraphs to read.
Yeah.
Because you really sense what it must be like to not be able to just speak. What it must be like not to be able to speak and then not have people make fun of the way you do speak. So he just stops talking. He just stops communicating. What a horrible thing to happen. And there's ostracism too. I think that's the other part of it. I don't think Jake's ostracized because he's really still part of the community. But there are people in that group that are ostracized. You know, Carl, when they find out he's homosexual, he's ostracized by his community. And he's one of the good guys. He's a rich guy. You know, he's one of the good
He's from the
guys.
Heights.
He's from the Heights, you know. And so there's this ostracism, and you know, it's just kind of just gets into you. You know what I'm saying? It just kind of doesn't seem right, doesn't seem fair, but it doesn't seem extraordinary either. It seems kind of normal. You know, anybody who's different on the outs is oftentimes ostracized. Probably we were guilty of it too. Everyone knows a little girl. There's a little girl in my school, and I must have been about 8 years old. She had polio, and we wouldn't play with her. Oh, it was awful. And I remember that now. I'm a lot older than 8 years old, and I still remember what we did to that poor little girl. And, you know, but that ostracism is sort of maybe it's innate in human nature to some extent. You have to fight it. You have to resist it. Maybe that's what it is. I don't know. But there's certainly the ostracism in this book, I think, of certain people. And there's definitely a caste system. You know, there's the flats. And, you know, what's Carl's mother's name? The one that kind of a snob.
She was such a snob.
Yeah, she's a snob, and she really shouldn't be, because she's from the flats.
That's
too.
right, she's from the flats and she married up,
She married up, exactly.
literally. And where Ruth married down, well, Ruth thought she was going to marry a lawyer. She thought Nathan was gonna be a lawyer and she was gonna live on the heights. And she was gonna sing, and she was gonna have music, and things were gonna be different.
And life is
So
gonna be really good.
she's got a lot of frustration, yeah, but it's that whole class system there that they just, you know, and then you put the Indians on top of it in the community that.
Yes, everybody's got a place. And I think the ultimate thing about, the one that's kind of funny in the book in a lot of ways, is this invasion of privacy. If you're in a community, I think Frank says this very well, says, you can't keep a secret in this town. It doesn't last, you know, it just goes as fast as a play.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of invasion of privacy. You know, you have, and I think the scene where they're pulling the rags out of the tub, listening to what's going on upstairs in the preacher's office, that is a perfect example of invasion of privacy. But it sort of goes everywhere. There's nothing that's ever kept to themselves. Ariel has become a skag because Carl says something and they all believe it. You know, she has no hope over them doing that. It's just kind of one of those kind of things. You know, people think what they want to think and they do what they want to do, and they don't care if it's your private business. You know, it just doesn't seem to matter. So I think this community thing is pretty real too, don't you? Can somebody think of some other examples of community in this thing? I'm just rambling on here. We got other ideas you want to pass on?
I had thought of something. Ruth has been brought into a situation that she didn't know was gonna exist when she married Nathan.
Oh, exactly.
And there, I certainly have never been the daughter of a minister, but I think we expect the families of ministers to be a little above. We hold them accountable for things we don't hold ourselves or our neighbors. And she wasn't fitting that mode at all.
That's right, she's just smoking and drinking.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And I really admired, because here was Nathan doing exactly what he thought he had to do.
Right.
And Ruth was doing what everybody else didn't approve of at all.
Exactly.
And my heart went out to Ruth. I thought, you know, and her bravery really in saying, I'm not fitting in here,
Right.
and I can't do this anymore, and I'm really, really sorry, but I gotta leave. Back in the early 60s,
That was unthinkable.
That would have been a huge deal
That would
back
take a
then.
lot
And it
of
is the
courage.
minister's wife, after all. Oh my gosh. What?
That's it.
Talk about invasion of privacy and some serious gossip going down. You know what's happening, so.
Yeah, I really, my heart just went out to her, and I kind of was real pleased when she said, I'm gone, I'm sorry. I can't do it." I mean, you know, I certainly grew up in the 50s and 60s, and you didn't see behavior like that.
No, you probably didn't. Certainly not in a religious environment, for sure. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
and I just thought she was very, very, very brave. And if you'll excuse me, so we can go back to how Nathan was so perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I love the line. It just, I laughed and laughed when he was asked, Nathan, to say a blessing. And Jake said, can we just have an ordinary grace?
Oh,
yeah.
Instead of, I mean, Nathan must have been very articulate.
Absolutely.
And went on and on and on and on.
Long
and on.
blessing.
Got everything covered.
And I love that line. Can we just have ordinary grace?
There you go. Absolutely. That's exactly the right thing. Your comment, yes. You were going to say?
I, for the longest time, thought maybe that Ruth and
Emil?
Emil
Emil, yeah.
Emil were,
Back together again?
Yeah.
because they were engaged at
So
one
did I,
point.
yeah.
And I couldn't help but think that maybe Ariel was his daughter.
I
thought about that.
Ooh, that is really that's good speculation.
But that didn't come out.
Right.
Very interesting. Okay, well, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Well, you know, in the book, as Frank looks back, not right at the moment, but as he looks back, he talks about his mother being a fragile egg. You know, just the outside is painted beautifully, but the inside's all not there. And I think, you know, in this book, I think this whole business about, we're gonna talk about skepticism and faith, that's really part of it. You know, she truly is a skeptic. And and I think part of what Cindy said earlier, that she has been, this is not the life she thought she was signing up to. Something happened while Nathan was in Korea, and it turned him in one direction and it didn't turn her. And so she has that skepticism, and she listens to him go on and on and on, and, you know, the ordinary blessing, she wants it to be that one sentence and get on with it.
Right.
You know, I think that's sort of really a very, very important element here, because, you know, what happens with a skeptic and what happens with a faithful person who has faith? Those are different kind of reactions, you know. We know that Ruth is this fragile egg. She's lost her daughter. Her life is not what she expected. And she's not rolling with the punches, you know what I mean? But Nathan, who also is grieving for the loss of his daughter, he's kind of rolling with the punches, you know what I mean? This
is not a new road to him, this
Yeah,
kind
it's
of
not a new-
loss.
maybe
It's
that's
not-
why.
I mean, losing a child, I think that's worse than anything, but at the same time, you know, he has, and he's also been trained to deal with,
Ruth
you know,
had
pastoral
her whole
care.
life hoping that Ariel would fulfill her dream.
Fulfill her
And
dream.
now that was over, her
Absolutely.
dream had died with Ariel.
Yeah, exactly,
Absolutely.
exactly. So I think there's that business, but I think the faith that Nathan has developed, for whatever reason, we don't know why exactly, does allow him to be able to handle the grief, and his training as a minister would do that also. So I think that's one of the important elements.
See, so many people, when they marry someone who's a minister, they know ahead of time what
Right,
life
what
is
they're
that they're getting
getting
into. They know that this person has always wanted to be a minister or whatever, that's what they've trained to. It must have been a shock to her that this lawyer went on, you know, that he was gonna be a lawyer.
A skilled
And
lawyer.
ministers don't make much money.
Exactly, and she's used to a fighter life.
Lawyers
That's
do.
true, that's true. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I'm sorry, were you gonna say something else too?
Well, I think the other thing about
Well,
this,
today, I was at pulmonary therapy, and the therapist has worked in nursing homes and everything, and he said, the other nurses would say, how can you be so calm when somebody codes? And he goes, because I've been where I've had guns pointed at me and death all around. You have to be calm, and I think that that's partly why Nathan was like he was,
yes,
because
exactly, his
he
experiences in the-
he was a officer in
Yes,
the
exactly.
military, and he had to be
Yeah.
the one in charge and the one in control of emotions and whatnot, and as a pastor or a minister, you have to do the same.
Exactly. You know, another element of this, of the skepticism and faith thing is, I think, and this we see in Jake a couple places for certain, early, for sure, and definitely in Ruth, is there's an anger, an absolute anger at those who have faith. Ruth is really mad at everybody, and she's maddest at Nathan because he seems to be not okay with it, but he's handling it, you know what I mean? And she talks about her anger, and Frank talks about her mother being angry. And Jake, at one point, when he's been up there in the room by himself, he talks about being angry at God. You know, so I think, you know, the skepticism or the doubts that are created by all these events that make no sense to a little kid and don't make much sense to his mom, those things generate that anger. And I think that's really part of this book too, is that those who find a way to have awful grace don't have that same anger, and it's good. And I think, you know, and one of the things we talked about also a little bit is the consequences of not being able to have faith. There are a lot of strong consequences, you know. This conflict is not resolved. And, you know, Ruth leaves. She's gone. She packs her toys and goes away. She doesn't go to the mill, she goes to her family.
Parents, yeah.
But she's not able at that point in time to resolve this conflict in her heart about why it happened to Ariel, and why is it happening to her, and why is her life not what she thought. And it doesn't take, it only changes when Jake stops stuttering and issues a simple one-word grace, and then she finds a way. I think that's kind of amazing. I mean, that is a real miracle in the book, I think. But I don't know how Jake pulled that trick. I don't really quite
But he never
understand.
studied again.
Never stuttered again. I know. So it's obviously very emotional.
Yeah.
Anybody else have
But he
comments
wasn't
about the
afraid
skepticism
anymore
of
either.
the faith? Anything else you want to add to this one?
About faith.
Yes, please.
I am a minister's daughter
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Aha, now we have one here.
in a small town in Kansas.
Oh my gosh, you're fitting right in.
12,500 friendly people.
Uh-huh.
And so, of course, I got in a lot of trouble, but that was expected of me. One scene that's really hit me was, I can remember my dad counseling,
Mhm,
and he wouldn't share.
of course.
But one time, a woman showed up at the door in a shower curtain. And my mother was upstairs with us, and it was hard for her, I think, you know, some of the counseling sessions that he had, but she did it. She did it,
Okay.
yeah.
So she didn't have that anger then?
She did not have the anger, yes, but,
But she knew she was marrying a minister.
she did, yes, yes. He was a chaplain in the Navy at first, during the Korean War, going back and forth, bringing home wounded on the ship. He would minister to them. We lived in San Francisco for a couple of years. But she knew, but it was not easy.
Not easy.
And she taught school because she felt like she didn't want to be a minister.
Okay.
She had her career,
That wasn't her call.
and I think that helped her.
Well, I probably did.
To deal.
And Ruth has lost her career. She has lost her career.
She's lost her identity.
Lost who she thought she was going to be altogether. Well, that's very interesting. Okay, you want to talk a little bit about loss, then we'll move on. I've got a couple other questions we're going to ask, but.
Yeah, there's a lot of loss in this book. You know, the loss of innocence, the loss of people, Bobby, Morris even.
Mhm.
I think, I don't know, where do we go with this?
Well, I think one of the things we can talk about just for a second is this. I mean, there's a lot of people who have losses, not just the big figures. You know, Danny O'Keefe is a little boy, the Indian boy, who's friends with Frank. And his family is ostracized because he's an Indian and
Oh, he's
his
got
uncle
his
is Warren.
uncle's the one that,
I think
Yeah.
he might have done it, you
Yeah.
know. You know, what happens in this case is, you know, this pain and suffering that they're experiencing because of events outside their control oftentimes causes them to leave. Danny and his family
They
leave,
move.
and ultimately the drums leave. The family leaves. They leave the little town and go to St. Paul.
Right.
So, you know, this pain and suffering doesn't just go away. They actually do something else. They move on. They're not better off maybe for it. We don't even know that for sure. But the bottom line is, there's a lot going on with this pain and suffering. It isn't just a few characters that are affected. It affects everybody. And that
in
is-
different
In
ways.
different ways. And you think they come up with some wisdom. They do in some cases. We know for sure that Frank gains wisdom out of this whole time. At least I think so. And so does Jay. I think Danny does too, because when we see Danny late at the end of the novel, he's gone to college, he's got a job, his life seems pretty normal. And I think if you read just the last chapter of this book, just the epilogue, you would sense, at least I did, that there was a lot of wisdom and a lot of acceptance, and it all takes place in the cemetery. That's where you see it. I mean, they've done it before.
Because they're going and they're visiting those graves of the people that were really, had a profound impact on that summer. But with the idea of forgiveness as our last overarching theme, there's the place that for me just kind of gave me chills, and again, it's Nathan. And Nathan is talking to Emil, and he says to Emil, when he realizes what all has happened with his daughter, and, you know, that this inappropriate relationship, even beyond his daughter being killed on this man's property, is this relationship that he created. He says, I pray for strength to forgive you, Emil, but I have no wish to see you again. And then he says to him something like, God be with you.
Yes.
But the way that Frank said he said it was not the way that he said it to his people in church as they were leaving, God be with you, as a blessing, as a way to go on, but kind of like, God's gonna see this through, and you're gonna have to look at yourself, and you're gonna have to realize what you did. It was kind of a different sort of take on something that would normally be seen as a blessing.
Yeah, that's really true. You know, and there's, you know, in this forgiveness thing, the thing that you see is that as the novel comes toward an end, there's a lot of forgiveness, and the family gets restored as best it can. It gets restored. That's really kind of good, because they come back together. The mother comes home. things are still not perfect, but they figured it out. And then they move away someplace else so that it's not a constant reminder. So I think it's really kind of cool. And they talk about, you know, the release from anger. When Ruth is no longer furious at God and Nathan and everybody else, and Jake is no longer furious at God, you know, they are restored. They are released. Their soul is sort of freed from all that anger. I think that's a really, really good part of this book.
I do too.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's part of the ordinary grace too.
Yep. And ordinary grace is something that's simple, it's uncomplicated, it's what we do every day. You know, it's the grace that we can provide to other people.
Right.
You know, it's the good life, it's knowing that the skies are blue, which is what Frank often sees. The skies are blue, it's another good day, and I can do something nice. And that's kind of, it's an ordinary grace. It's just not something spectacular, it's just ordinary, everyday, good living. What do you think?
Yeah, this acceptance for who they are, I think is a big part of it. You know, that was something that Bobby Cole had, the little boy. He was, in his own simple way, he was happy with the life he had. He was perfectly content in what he was doing, to just sit and get lost in his thoughts. And that was the opposite of what Frank was at that particular time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that who they came around to at the end, the people that they were at the end, through all the series of little individual graces along the way, helped them to move forward. Because any of these events that happened, any one of them could have been crippling to a person, and they could have been stunted there at that particular moment, and the anger and anguish could have just eaten them away and ruined their lives. But they all found a way, step by step, to get past it.
You know, and at the end of the book, I'm gonna want to hear something we get to say. At the end of the book, you know, Jake and Frank and his father are there in the cemetery.
Right.
And Frank says, you know, we never talk about the summer of 1961. It is resolved. And that's kind of cool, because you think, with all that trauma, they'd rehash it. But they're resolved. It's resolved for them. It is what it is. Life is on. It's an ordinary grace. I received wisdom from my experience. That's kind of how I thought about it at the end of the book. Okay, so, what do y'all think? What's the thing that you're going to take away from this book? What's the thing that's in your mind that you're going to walk out the door and think about for the next 5 minutes or 10 minutes after you leave here? Besides dinner and a drink, whatever. Anybody? What did you take away from the book? Yes.
Well, I read it like 6 months ago, or
Okay.
maybe longer.
Mhm.
I'm gonna go home and read it again. And
You know, it's better the second time.
Yeah.
I will get more out of it just
Yeah.
because of this discussion, because when I read that book, I thought, you know, that is ordinary. I wasn't all that impressed. And I thought it was a good book, but I
Yeah.
didn't know it would merit a book review.
Well,
I would
maybe
be,
it doesn't.
I would be remiss if I didn't suggest y'all, I don't know, how many of you listen to audiobooks? A lot of people kind of say, oh, no, you know, it's not really reading. I love audiobooks. This book really lends itself to it. And one thing that Kent Kruger said in an interview that I read was, I think it was at the end of the audiobook, he was talking, he said, this book came to him, the way the book came to him was in narrative style in his head. He could just hear the story.
Wow.
And he said this book, he believes, is truly made to be listened to. It's a story to be
And so
heard.
I listened to
Did
it.
you listen to
I
it?
did listen to
Oh,
it.
it's just beautiful.
And I
lost
maybe
it.
that's why I loved it so much.
It's-
But I did listen to this, and I don't do a whole lot of listening to books.
It's really a beautiful book to listen to, and if
The narrator is wonderful.
the narrator's really good, and if you haven't done audiobooks before, I challenge you to try it a little bit. It may be kind of a different way for
They
you
offer it
to,
through a different
to
way, I don't know.
you know, give a
But
boost to your
anyway, that's
reading
how I
life
read
and
it.
try
That's
something
how I read
different.
it.
There's some really good ones out,
Audio.
and the audio productions, and they are productions, are getting more and more elaborate. And sometimes they use celebrity people to read, like I mentioned earlier to someone we were talking to, Tom Hanks
And
reads
Meryl
Anne
Streep.
Patchett's.
Ann Patchett does them, yeah.
Yeah, so it's the Dutch House, and it's
Yeah.
wonderful. Meryl Streep does Tom Lake by Anne Patchett. But and then another one that had a bunch of different people was Daisy Jones and the Six, totally different kind of book, but a really kind of interesting audiobook. So anyway, I put that out there just because I think audiobooks are great. It's another way in our busy world to get some more reading done.
I don't always love audiobooks, but there are certain books that I really enjoy. The Gentleman from Moscow. I really enjoyed listening to that.
There's lots of good books out there like that. Another question that I wanted to ask y'all is, and then we'll go back to that what stayed with you. Do you guys reread books?
Not very often.
This is my second time on this book, and I read it again in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I liked it much. I loved it the first time.
Yeah.
I just could not get enough of it the second time. I couldn't believe the way it fit together. It's beautifully crafted. And when you're reading it the second time, you can see the foreshadowing. You can see why things are in place and the way they are. And I mean, to me, it almost was like a drawstring bag that had all these elements around it, and he's pulling until it's all captured up inside it and all fits. It's just beautifully done, and you see the craftsmanship when you're reading it a second time. Also, some of the books maybe that you read before that you liked at a different point in your life, you read it again and it really means something different now. You know, like one that East of Eden is one that came to it that I've read a couple times, and it's different now reading it as an adult versus when I was in high school.
I think, just in your comment, I think it's kind of interesting. You know, this book, his publishers didn't like it. They didn't want to publish it. But you know, it made them a lot of money. So they published it. Sell millions of copies. Won lots of awards. I mean, it's just crazy. So
He
really,
got an Edgar Award,
yeah,
which is a
winner,
big mystery.
It's a big mystery book award. It's true. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, and maybe they didn't like it because it was kind of ordinary. It's not, mystery's not much of a mystery if you think about it. You know, there's not a whole lot going on. So, but still, I think that it's interesting that it appeals to a lot of people, not necessarily the publishers, did it because they've been publishing his other books, you know what I mean?
Right.
And so I think that's kind of interesting. But I am curious, you know, what are you going to take away from Ordinary Grace? What would be the thing that you walk out the door with, like say, between dinner and drinks, what are you going to talk about? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I think we learned, I think I learned that oftentimes we go through in our lives, you know, anybody who's got the age, go through trying times, and if we open ourselves to it, grace will come, and it might be awful and horrible and all those, but we learn. And in learning, a lot of this conciliation goes on.
There you go.
And these are instances that we keep forever.
And that's that ordinary grace, right?
That's
That's
exactly
ordinary
right.
grace.
It's just ordinary.
I think sometimes when you're aware of it, you start paying more attention to it. You know, when you're looking for good or you're looking for something, a lot of people keep journals, gratitude journals. And so they're looking for things that they know they're gonna have to write something in their journal later, so they start finding more and more good things that happen in the day because they're searching for them.
Anybody else want to tell us what you think? Well, we
Just one
managed to,
thing, Deborah?
yeah.
My career was in healthcare, and I was a non-clinical person in healthcare. But I know many hospital chaplains, and I will tell you that you can see many medical miracles when you work in hospitals, but you can also see so many small spiritual things that happen that can't be explained on a day-to-day basis that people experience together, and it stays with them as a spiritual experience for the rest of their life. And that's the spiritual part of this book is what got to me, because I lived it every day and I saw these characters sometimes recognize it at the time, in real time, and many times not recognize it until later. But it was the spiritualness of this book that I just loved.
Well, you know, Kent talks about that. Kruger actually talks about that a little bit. He says that our lives are spiritual journeys. I don't necessarily think that means necessarily it's a Christian journey or a Jewish journey. It's about the sense that there is something in the soul, the spirit of man, that is working and can experience joy and peace. And I think that's a word we didn't talk about very much. Peace and calmness as you go on. But Kruger actually talks a lot about the spiritual journey. He does it in some of his other books as well.
Especially with the Ojibwe.
The Ojibwe stuff. Yeah, he talks a lot about it in his mysteries. His Cork O'Connor mysteries. He talks a lot about that sense of spirit. And I think that's really kind of what this book's about. It's about that sort of, you know, making your soul feel and experience and become wiser and calmer and peaceful. Anybody else want to say something? Well, we talked for an hour and 20 minutes, we probably should go home.
It was enjoyable.
Thank you very much
Thanks
for
for
coming.
being here.
Thank you. Yeah, very good.